Sean, we're rolling.
Hello, and welcome to this educational video on the independence movement on Zimbabwe.
I'm Jake Spada.
I'm Quinn Kelly.
And I'm Sean McGinnis. And first, Quinn will give you some quick background on Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia, as it was known until 1980, is a landlocked nation of 13 million people, occupying the plateau between the Limpopo and Zambezi rivers, bordered by Zambia to the north, Botswana to the west, Mozambique to the east, and South Africa to the south.
The British named Rhodesia after the British colonizer and industrialist Cecil John Rhodes. Rhodes believed that the English were the predominant race.
In the colony of Rhodesia, the native Africans were ruled by an all-white government in which they were not allowed to participate. Only whites were granted the right to vote and elect leaders governing their land.
Laws were passed which prohibited the presence of Africans in many public places. During the colonial rule that extended from 1890 to 1979, the white minority dominated and oppressed the native population and deprived them of their land.
Prior to the revolution, they demanded change only within the limitations of the imperial constitution, calling for equal access to jobs and the right to participate in the government. In the 1960s, the nationalist vision of freedom became more radical. They now demanded an overthrow of the minority rule if their rights were to be fully recognized.
In 1960, the National Democratic Party was founded with the goal of achieving African rule by gradual means. Its members demonstrated, rioted, and committed acts of arson in hopes of attracting the attention of England and compelling the British to intervene and force a white handover of power in Rhodesia.
The NDP was subsequently banned by the Rhodesian government in 1961, but the group was reconstituted under the name Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, in 1962, and was led by Joshua Nkomo. I'll hand it over to Jake for the aims and objectives of this group.
Jake.
The establishment of a one man, one vote as a basis of government in Zimbabwe. The unification of the African people so as to allow them to liberate themselves from imperialism and colonism. The elimination of oppression in all forms, and the development of the best values in the African tradition to facilitate the establishment of a desirable order. As their ideas became more radical, Africans began to realize that violence and bloodshed was inevitable. The Rhodesians also recognized the revolutionary nature of the ZAPU's goals and banned the group in 1963 so as to avoid conflict.
But ZAPU did not dissolve. It instead went underground. In 1963, internal conflict within the party led to a split and formation of Zimbabwe African National Union under the leadership of Nambanje Sithole.
The ZANU party shared the same basic goals as the ZAPU, but they envisioned slightly different means of achieving them. The ZANU was in favor of immediate armed confrontation of the enemy and self-reliance, but the ZAPU was still seeking intervention from the international arena. The split occurred loosely among the ethnic lines, with the ZANU being strongly aligned with the Shoana, and the ZAPU with the Nimbele.
As a result of this international conflict in the independence movement, armed conflict between the two groups and competition for the support of the peasants prevented the Zimbabweans from forming a strong united front of the opposition to the Rhodesians. The tactics of guerrilla warfare were employed by both groups beginning in 1960. Armed resistance to the colonial regimen consisted largely of attacks on white farmers and destruction of the property of white settlers. Freedom fighters who performed these acts were recruited from the villages in the rural areas.
In the late 1960s, warfare began to decline, and members of the ZANU and ZAPU were calling their political and military unity. The early 1970s were characterized by shifting alliances among the nationalists. Opposition to the Rhodesians occurred mostly through political means, through some small-scale military action. Did continue through the 70s.
Progress towards a resolution of the conflict in Zimbabwe began with the formation of the Patriotic Front Party in 1976. The Patriotic Front represented a unified alliance of the ZANU and the ZAPU. It was jointly led by Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe. The founding of a single party which represented the interests of the nationalist movement for independence facilitated constructive negotiations with the British and the Rhodesians.
At the Geneva Conference in 1976, however, the Rhodesians were not yet willing to accept the Zimbabweans' terms for negotiations of peace, which called for its independence by December 1st, 1977. Guerrilla warfare was escalated again in 1977 through 1978 because Nkomo and Mugabe felt it was their only means of making the Rhodesians understand the seriousness of their demands. But neither they nor the Rhodesians ever achieved a clear-cut military victory. The conflict was finally resolved at the Lancaster House Conference in England in 1979. It was agreed that free elections would be held in which all parties would be allowed to participate and all people would vote. Under the new government, Zimbabwe was independent of colonial rule. In 1980, Robert Mugabe was elected president of the free nation, and finally, Zimbabwe was free.